So I'm from Venezuela, but I always start my story not with the news articles that you might read about Venezuela and like the crisis, but like a funny personal story I had. So when I was 16, I had a date with a girl that I liked. Now that was something surprising. I was a very nerdy guy, still am. Now it's fine because in DC everybody's kind of nerdy, but in Maracaibo, where I lived, that time wasn't good. But for some reason, I met this girl through mutual friends and Model UN and texted her, and she accepted a date. That was very surprising for me, so I was very excited, very nervous, and I planned absolutely everything for that day. I planned what I was going to wear, where we are going to go, what I was going to say, extremely nervous that this has to go well. So I planned everything. I didn't plan, however, that I was living in Venezuela in the midst of a deep economic and humanitarian crisis. Now, what happens? The day of the date comes. I'm very excited. Wake up. I was going to get all ready, but there was an issue. There was not electricity in a huge chunk of the city, including where I was living, including my home. Now, that doesn't sound necessarily ideal. You may say, well, it's not that bad. It's not the end of the world. But there was an issue. First, my city, it's very, very warm. Extremely. So in a good day, you could have 80 degrees, 75 to 80 degrees. I'm like, that's a great day. 80 degrees is like cool. So I was nervous. It was very hot that day. Sweaty. I was sweating because of the nervousness and sweating because it was 80 degrees in the city. And I was like this close to canceling, but I said if I cancel, she might realize that she actually agreed to a date with me and might cancel. So I'll say, let's go ahead. Let's go push ahead. So I get ready. It's not the best. I'm not in the best mindset, but I said, let's go. Go downstairs. Get my dad's car. He's gonna borrow it. And the problem is, I have to actually go down the car. No electricity. I also couldn't get a shower because no electricity. And move the garage door like manually because it's no electricity. So I was sweaty because I was nervous. Sweaty because I couldn't get a shower, and sweaty because I had to actually pick the whole garage door by myself. Eventually, I picked her. Today, she was looking beautiful. We went to this coffee shop near it was a middle point between her house and my house. Cup of coffee and a pastry. The date was fine. It was not catastrophic. It was not good. My mindset was still I was still stressed by the whole no electricity going around. My plans going completely into tatters. But after a while, I'll say, well, I might salvage the situation. After this, I'll pay. We'll get an ice cream, which at that point I needed it because of I was very sweaty at that point. It was very hot. So I'll pay. We'll pay and let's get out. Now, I'm going to go and pay, and something happened. Because there was no electricity in a huge part of the city, a lot of the time there was no connectivity. It was difficult to get any connection going on. Now you say, and what happens through that is that if there's no connectivity, it's difficult to pay with your debit card or your credit card. You say, well, pay in cash. It's just like, how much could it be, like 2 coffees and a pastry, right? You probably have like $10. Although probably if you go to Starbucks, like 2 cups and a coffee and a pastry will be like 30. I don't know. Starbucks is extremely expensive, guys. But there was hyperinflation going on in Venezuela. So if I paid in cash, I would probably have to, carry a suitcase of cash to pay for a cup of coffee? That's not practical, so nobody used cash at that moment. So I go to the cashier, try to pay. Of course, doesn't work. Credit cards, there's no connectivity. The point of sale doesn't go. The transaction never goes through. And I'm like there negotiating with the cashier because I can't pay with cash because that's impractical. I can't pay with my credit card or debit card because there's no connectivity. And I can't just leave because that's dining and dashing. So I'm negotiating for 20 to 30 minutes with the cashier, see what can we do. Eventually, I have to call my dad, who can go to a friend's house that has electricity, make almost like a wire transfer to the coffee shop, to the 2 cups of coffee and a pastry, so they can actually tell the cashiers, hey, let me leave. I ended up staying more time negotiating how to pay for that than the actual date. At the end of the day, she was great. She was understanding, Of course, she's living in the same country. She understood the whole situation. She was gracious, but there was not a second date at all. Of course there wasn't. It was a terrible date. Now, why do I tell this story? It's a funny story. The thing is that what makes this story funny, there's no electricity, there's a little bit of issue with the cash, there's no water, there's public services failing. In this case, the bad thing was like I had a bad day. But for many people, it was not a funny story. And for most of the time, it was not, oh, you had a bad date. It's just you're losing your livelihood, you're becoming poorer, and in many cases, it was an issue of life and death. Because what happened, and what happened to me on that date, is that the people in power, politicians, authoritarian politicians, in this case socialist authoritarian politicians, made policy decisions that hurt millions of people, destroy an entire country, just for them to stay in power. And those decisions turned my world, the world of my family, the world of my friends, and the world of 30 million Venezuelans upside down. So, before I talk about Venezuela, by the way, Venezuela, it's a country in the northern part of South America. I'm going to talk a little bit about the story of my family because the story of my family is the story of Venezuela in the 20th century, in many ways. So my dad's side of the family, they came from China during the Second World War. Escaped China. China was, of course, midst of invasion by the Japanese, also civil war, a lot of strife. And they went to Venezuela, which sounds like a bit of a random place to go from China, because it was, although a small country, a very prosperous one and a promising one. You could go to Venezuela, which at that point was, the oil production was exploding, and build a life for yourself. And that's what my family, from my dad's side, did. They came to Venezuela with little to no money, and they built a life. Of course, it was tough. They didn't know the language. Chinese and Venezuelan culture are not the same, right? You don't need to be a geopolitical expert to know that China and Venezuela are not the same. But they got there, had a prosperous life, had businesses, had a house, married, and became successful. My mom's side of the family was the other side of the Venezuelan story. Because just like, by the way, like my father's family, millions of immigrants across the world also went to Venezuela. People from Italy, people from Spain, people from Syria, Lebanon, etc. My mom's side of the family, they're the other part of the Venezuelan story in the 20th century. They lived in the countryside in the state of Táchira for a long time. It was a tough life, it was hardworking, it's the countryside. But in the 20th century, they decided to move to Maracaibo, because it's a city, an oil city that was an up-and-coming city. And just like them, millions of people within the country went from the countryside to the city looking for more opportunities. And they actually also did pretty well. Both my mom and dad, they were among the first people in their family to go to college. Not the first, but among the first to go to university. And they eventually met, they married, and they had a house, a car, and they had all the expectations that me and my sister, they had all the expectations that both of us would have the same life, actually better lives than they had. Because they told me all the stories. They had all the reason to believe it. And every time I heard my grandparents talk about how Venezuela was, my parents talk about how Venezuela was, my uncles and my aunts talk about it, I felt it was such a comforting story, such a feel-good story. But it was a story. For them, that was their country. That was their reality. That was their life. They lived it. But for me, it was a nighttime story. It wasn't the reality. Because the reality is the Venezuela that me and my sister grew, that my friends grew, that my date grew at that time, was a very different one. It was one where there was not political stability, there was not economic prosperity, and the future always looked darker and dimmer than the past, than what you were living right now. And what happened? Why did Venezuela went from a democracy, which we were a democracy in a continent that was filled with authoritarians in Argentina, in Cuba, in in Chile, in Nicaragua, a country filled with civil wars across the region, like in Colombia, in El Salvador. We didn't have any of those. We had prosperity, we had democracy, we had peace. But now we don't. So what happened? So this guy happened. So this guy is Hugo Chavez. He was a military coup leader in 1992. He led a bloody, very bloody coup against the democratic elected president of Venezuela at the time. And in 1998, he became president. Now, why a guy who made a coup, bloody coup against the democracy, and if you were telling me, you said, Daniel, you're telling me that Venezuela is great. Why did people elect this guy? You know, why change? Well, Venezuela was good, first in hindsight, and second, relatively speaking, to their neighbors. But it's not that we didn't have problems. We had problems. We had some structural economic problems, economic issues that need to be fixed. There was income inequality. There was also a lot of corruption, and a lot of people just didn't trust the government and the politicians and the political parties that have been ruling the country since 1958. And Chavez, after he did his coup and became famous, eventually he got pardoned and ran for office. He made a promise to the Venezuelan people. The promise was, okay, I'll make you guys a bargain, a deal. I will give you a new country. Give you a country that's more prosperous, a country that's more fair, that's more free, that's more democratic, a country that which you can be better and your kids can be better. The only thing that I ask in exchange is to give me a little bit of power. That's it. Just a little bit of power. Vote for me. Give me a little bit of power. I'll rewrite the Constitution, create a whole new country, blank slate. And a lot of people were upset with the whole system. They didn't feel represented. And it was a good deal. It was a good bargain for many. Actually, for 56 to 58% of the people, it was a good deal. Actually, an uncle and me voted for him and lived to regret that decision. So did Chavez fulfill his promise? Partly. Part of it he did. The part of gave me more power, so that part he fulfilled. As soon as he got elected to office, he rewrote the Constitution in 1999, packed the court with his cronies and with his friends, packed the military with his cronies and his friends, and packed the national oil company, which is very significant if you're an oil-dependent country, with his political cronies and political friends. And did he deliver a more democratic, prosperous, and free Venezuela? No, he did not. He actually gutted the checks and balances system that we had. He instituted some social programs that benefited people but didn't actually help them to lift them up from poverty, but just to keep them afloat so they could vote for him for a while. Corruption that was already bad became rampant with him because with no checks and balances and with the oil prices going up, corruption was rampant. And the result of that mismanagement, not only mismanagement, it's actually a deliberate decision to tank the Venezuelan economy, to create an unsustainable path for the Venezuelan economy in exchange of ensuring that he and his people remain in power. The result for that was an economic and humanitarian catastrophe, a broken promise. So this photo you see there is people in, pretty sure this is in Caracas, of people eating food from the garbage in Venezuela. This is a real photo, and I can attest this is real because in my city, in my house, I saw a lot of people literally from my house roaming through garbage to find food. And you see, these were people that were middle class, not people that were, that's not something that used to happen all the time, like before. Didn't. There were not people in the homeless situation or anything like that. I remember people, teachers in my high school that lost substantial weight in a very short amount of time. It's not because they were doing keto fasting. It was because they didn't have enough food. And the little that they had went to their kids, went to them, and they lost weight. Actually, we call it the Maduro diet. Maduro was eventually the president who succeeded Chavez. Chavez died in 2013 and handpicked his successor in 2013. And Maduro had a choice. But that time, 2013 approximately, oil prices, which had financed the whole unsustainable situation that Chavez did, because not only Chavez created a lot of graft and corruption, he also nationalized a lot of private companies, indebted the whole country, and imposed price controls and other policies that are pretty bad economic policies, but that were good for his political prospects. So Maduro had a choice. He could either reform the economy, take the decisions that he knew were good for the nation's economy, but that would probably cost him politically, actually might even cost him his power, because the people who keep him in power will be angry, especially corrupt politicians, military, etc. Or he could double down. He could just double down, ensure he remains in power, and yes, the whole country will go to economic chaos, but who cares? Of course, he picked the latter. During his time in office, he didn't do any other reforms. He printed an immense amount of money to sustain the very unsustainable economic system that Chavez has instituted. Corruption remained pretty much a daily thing for the government practices. And what happened when you have a bunch of inflation, when you have price controls, when you have government control over large sectors of the economy, is that you have one, scarcity, and second, hyperinflation. So the United States lived a little bit through inflation over the last few years. 8%, 9% inflation, especially in 2022, if I'm correct, was the height of the inflation with 9%. We still have inflation, but it's like a 4, still significant. Venezuela had thousands percent inflation. It was 10,000% inflation, 20,000% inflation. It's difficult even to measure. So to understand this, my family bought an apartment. It was, I'm pretty sure it was like 2 million bolivares in 2013, I guess. Last time I went home was 2018. A bottle of Pepsi, 2 liter, was $1.5 million bolivares. So if you bought a home in 2013, 2014, 4 or 5 years down the road after hyperinflation, that home was valued like one bottle of Pepsi, the amount of money. A bottle of Pepsi and a half. So if you have any savings, the savings got wiped. If you relied, like my granddad did, in pensions, you became poor overnight. And that created a lot of strain to millions of people, because if you go to work a 9 to 5, at the time you get out of work, at the time you clock out, your money is worth so much less than when you clocked in. And there's the little food that there's available becomes extremely expensive. And this hurts working people the most. So you had that, the GDP dropped. I think we lost 2/3 of the GDP in like a span of 4 years. And what happened after that, of course, if people don't see opportunities, if people don't see future, if people see prices going like thousands percent through the roof and really no opportunities, is that you have an exodus. So Venezuela, historically, we have not been a country that was experienced a lot of like migration from Venezuela to other countries. Usually it was the other way around. People from all across the region came to Venezuela, especially countries I already mentioned, in Colombia as well. Of course, because of this, the tables turned. Venezuela is a country of about 30 million people, ballpark estimate. Out of those 30 million, 7.8, if I'm correct, have fled the country over the last 8 to 9 years. That's 27% of the country approximately. No wars, no natural disasters. There was not an earthquake, there was not a tsunami, it's not a hurricane. It was the extremely bad and right down evil political decisions made by Maduro and his people, by Maduro and Chavez, to keep himself in power at the expense of the entire country that caused this humanitarian catastrophe. This has impacted Venezuelan society in ways that it's difficult to explain. Because we Venezuelans usually used to stay relatively close, same city. You have all the extended family, reunited only for Christmas, but every month, every week. Cousins of cousins, uncles and aunts. That's the stereotype of Hispanics having extremely large extended family is kind of true. But now, we don't have that. That was the life my dad and my mom had. That was the life my grandma, my granddad had. Now, they're completely isolated. Families are spread across the world. They're in the US, they're in Canada, they're in Colombia, in Chile, Argentina, Peru, Brazil, Uruguay, Spain, you name it. Whatever country you can think, there are probably a lot of Venezuelans there. It's not because they wanted to go, it's because they were forced to. And again, imagine if like 27% of America, the United States, that's like, I think, 80 million people, approximately, fled in 6 years. Imagine the impact that creates. Now, you might be saying, well, Daniel, I mean, the answer is pretty simple. Just get rid of the government, right? The government is having a bad job. You can either vote them out or just go into the streets, protest, get rid of them. I've seen them. I've seen the movies. That works. Well, your answer will be, you're correct. You're right. The answer is to get rid of the government. That's right. It's not simple, though. That's important. You're not necessarily correct. And we understood it, Venezuelans. So again, we became a democracy. We're a stable democracy for 40 years. That leaves something in people. People know how to live in democracy, how to live in liberty, and they want to keep it that way. So, I mean, again, Venezuelans were not cowards. If there's a little bit of Latin American history that you guys know, probably you know a little bit is Simón Bolívar. He's a Venezuelan, freed like 5 countries. And we're proud heirs to that. And we went to the streets. Venezuelans went to the streets in 2002, 2014, in 2017, in 2019. Millions of people went to the streets protesting against the government to take democracy back and create and rebuild the country that the Chavista government had destroyed. And we knew that, of course, this was not risk-free. The government repressed us with tear gas, pellets, bullets, paramilitary groups hounded protesters. A lot of them got killed, a lot of them got imprisoned, and a lot of them got tortured. Still, we went out. We knew the risk, still we went out. But it wasn't enough. Streets, images like this were pretty common. I went to a lot of those protests. My family went to a lot of those protests. All my friends went to at least one of those protests, knowing the risks. But it wasn't enough because we didn't, I mean, if the government had the military on their side, they could withstand a while. And if you had an economy that was destroyed, if you had hyperinflation, if your family and your friends, if your family was starving, how long do you think you could stay up in the streets protesting and not working? Not a lot of time. You could stay one day, even a week, maybe 2, protesting and not working, but eventually your kids are going to say, what's for lunch? And you need to go to work. You can't go protest. You can't afford it. And the government knows this. So the economic crisis they created to stay in power, to keep their cronies alive, and the military support alive, eventually, and that created this amount of protests, was also a weapon they used to quell the protests down. That and repression. That was enough. And the Venezuelans will still find many ways to try to recover the country and restore the democracy that we have and rebuild it. But it's tough. It's very tough. In the movies it shows us very easy, but it's tough to get rid of a dictatorship. It's tough, especially when it's been 25 years in power. That creates political dynamics that are very difficult to break. Now, eventually, in 2017, the things that started to go a little bit upside down, started to go a little bit right side up. I came to the States in 2017, came to the University of South Florida, student visa in Tampa. If you're ever in Florida, go to Tampa. You can miss Orlando, Miami, it's fine. Go to Tampa. Tampa's great. And I went there, and it was great. It's a good time. I made new friends. This time, whenever I had a date, there was no blackouts. There was no issues with paying. So I couldn't, actually, there was no excuse. If they went bad, I couldn't blame anybody else. It was just be me. So that was the only drawback. That was the only drawback. But it was great. Eventually, in 2019, my family came to the States, and They're based in Florida, and in 2021 I came to Washington D.C., did my graduate school, and I'm working right there. And I found out, I've heard when I was a kid all the stories about the U.S. The American dream and all that. It sounds like a little bit cliche and like, yeah, whatever. But it was a story that we were told a lot. And when I came here and compared the opportunities, I said, well, it's kind of true in some regards, in many regards actually. And I became being very grateful to the United States. And I came to the Dissident Project, and the premise of the project is just tell my story to many Americans, as much as Americans as I can, especially high school, middle school, so they can understand the great blessings they have of just living here. Sometimes the political situation might seem bleak. There's a lot of problems in the U.S. Of course, it's not perfect at all. But there's a lot of good things still. And it's important to keep them that way. To keep the good things working and to improve the things that are not working. And to never take for granted democracy, vote, liberty, the things that have kept the United States as a democracy for so much time. Never take them for granted, because the Venezuelans took it for granted. My mom, my dad, my granddad, my grandmom, cousins, uncles, they all took the Venezuelan democracy and relative prosperity for granted because they have lived through that forever. But when they lost it, when we were no longer free, when we were no longer prosperous, when we were no longer a democracy, it's been difficult to gain them back. It's been 25 years trying to get them back. And we're still fighting. I'm certain that we'll eventually get those liberties back and rebuild the country. But in the meantime, it's been a lot of time and a lot of suffering for millions of people. So it's always important it's better to keep what you have than to have to regain.